The deafening crack of a rifle shot pierced the morning silence, sending a flock of startled birds into the cloudless Wyoming sky as Grace Fairfield collapsed to her knees beside the freshly killed rabbit. Her hands trembled not from the rifle's recoil, but from the gnawing hunger that had been her constant companion for nearly 2 weeks. Independence Valley, Wyoming Territory, 1876. Grace tucked a strand of copper hair behind her ear and carefully wrapped the rabbit in the threadbare cloth she'd brought along. It wasn't much, hardly enough to feed 3 hungry children, but it was something. She'd become a decent shot over the past year since Thomas had passed, though hunting had never been a skill she'd imagined needing when she'd left Philadelphia as a bright-eyed bride 5 years earlier. The long walk back to the cabin gave her too much time to think. The mortgage was 3 months past due. The winter had been brutal, and spring had brought little relief to their remote homestead 15 miles outside of Sweetwater Springs. Her food stores had dwindled to a handful of dried beans, some flour with more weevils than substance, and whatever game she could manage to shoot. As Grace approached the small log cabin, her children burst through the door. 9-year-old Samuel with his father's serious eyes, 7-year-old Emily with braids bouncing, and little 4-year-old Michael toddling behind. "Mama, did you get anything?" Samuel asked, hope evident in his voice. Grace forced a smile. "1 rabbit, not a fat one, but it'll make a good stew." "I'm so hungry," Emily whined, clutching her stomach. "I know, sweet pea. We'll eat soon." Grace ruffled her daughter's hair as she entered the cabin, hiding the way her own stomach cramped painfully. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, saving what little they had for the children. Inside, Grace set about preparing the rabbit, using every bit she could, stretching the meat with the last of their dried beans and wild onions she'd foraged. The tantalizing smell filled their 1-room cabin, making her mouth water and her knees weak. When the stew was finally done, she ladled generous portions into the children's bowls, her heart breaking at how eagerly they devoured it. "Aren't you having any, Mama?" Samuel asked, his observant eyes missing nothing. "I'll eat after you 3 are finished," she lied, knowing there would be nothing left. "I snacked on some berries while I was out." Samuel didn't look convinced, but hunger overrode his concern as he returned to his meal. Grace busied herself with mending, ignoring the painful hollowness in her belly. She'd gone hungry before. She would survive. Her children needed the nourishment more than she did. That night, after tucking the children into the bed they shared, Grace sat by the dying fire and allowed herself to cry silently. Thomas had been a good man, but not a practical one. His dreams of a prosperous ranch had died with him when influenza swept through the territory last year. Now she was left with 3 hungry children, mounting debts, and no way to keep their home much longer. Mourning brought little relief. The children's listless movements and hollow-cheeked faces were stark reminders of their predicament. Grace forced herself up despite the dizziness, determined to check the snares she'd set yesterday. "I'll be back before midday," she promised, kissing each child goodbye. "Samuel, mind your brother and sister." The spring sunshine mocked her desperation as she trudged through the meadow. The first snare was empty, as was the second. At the third, she found a prairie chicken caught in the wire. It was small, but it was food. As she stood up with her prize, the world tilted suddenly. Grace staggered, black spots dancing in her vision. She'd pushed too hard on too little sustenance. Fighting unconsciousness, she sank to the ground, the prairie chicken clutched to her chest. "Madam, madam, are you all right?" The voice seemed to come from far away. Grace forced her eyes open to find a tall figure silhouetted against the sun, the brim of his hat casting his face in shadow. "My children," she whispered, trying to stand. I need to get back to my children. Strong hands steadied her. Easy now, you look about ready to keel over. As her vision cleared, Grace found herself looking into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-browned face beneath a shock of dark hair. "Name's Kieran Zavala," the stranger said, concern evident in his expression. "I was passing through, saw you fall." "When's the last time you ate, madam?" Grace tried to straighten her shoulders, dignity battling with weakness. "I'm fine. Just a momentary spell." Kieran's skeptical look told her he wasn't fooled. He was dressed like a cowhand-worn denims, leather vest over a faded blue shirt and scuffed boots. A revolver hung low on his hip, but his manner wasn't threatening. "I've got supplies on my pack horse," he said. "Looks like you could use some help." "I don't accept charity," Grace said stiffly, even as her stomach betrayed her with an audible growl. Kieran's expression softened. "Not offering charity, madam, just being neighborly." Grace hesitated, pride warring with desperation. Her children's faces flashed in her mind, hungry, growing thinner by the day. She swallowed hard. "My cabin's about a mile north. I've got 3 children waiting." Kieran nodded, helping her to her feet. He whistled sharply, and 2 horses appeared from behind a copse of trees, a magnificent chestnut stallion and a sturdy pack horse loaded with supplies. "Can you ride?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said, though it had been months since she'd had a horse to ride. Thomas had sold their last one to pay for medicine during his illness. Kieran helped her onto his stallion before retrieving her prairie chicken and mounting behind her. The closeness of a strange man should have alarmed her, but all Grace felt was relief at not having to walk back to the cabin. "What brings you to these parts, Mr. Zavala?" she asked, trying to keep herself alert. "Just Kieran, please," he said, his voice rumbling near her ear. "I'm heading to Montana. Got a job offer from an old friend starting up a cattle operation. You're a long way from the main trail." "I prefer the scenic route," he said, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. As they approached the cabin, Grace's children burst outside. Their initial excitement at seeing their mother turned to wariness at the sight of the stranger. "It's all right," Grace called to them. "This is Mr. Zavala. He's just passing through and offered us some help." Samuel stood protectively in front of his younger siblings, his father's pocket knife gripped in his small hand. The sight broke Grace's heart even as it filled her with pride. "Put that away, Samuel," she said gently. "Mr. Zavala means us no harm." Kieran dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands steady around her waist. "That's quite a brave boy you've got there, madam." "Grace," she corrected him. "Grace Fairfield. And these are my children, Samuel, Emily, and Michael." Kieran tipped his hat to each child solemnly. "Pleased to meet you all. I hope you don't mind, but I've been riding all day and could use a place to rest. I've got provisions to share if you'll allow me to impose on your hospitality." Grace recognized the fiction for what it was, a way to help without wounding her pride, and felt a rush of gratitude. "We'd be happy to have you, Mr. Zavala." From his pack horse, Kieran unloaded a bounty that made the children's eyes widen: bacon, coffee, cornmeal, flour, sugar, canned peaches, and even a small sack of hard candies. There was salt pork, dried apples, and jerky. It was more food than the Fairfield family had seen in months. "This is too much," Grace protested weakly. "Not at all," Kieran replied, his voice matter of fact. "Can't eat it all myself, and it'll just weigh down my horse. You'd be doing me a favor." Within an hour, the cabin was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of bacon and cornbread. Grace found herself seated at her own table while Kieran insisted on cooking. The children watched his every move, stomachs growling audibly. When the food was ready, Kieran served generous portions to each child, then Grace, before taking a modest amount for himself. "Eat, Mrs. Fairfield," he said quietly when he noticed her hesitation. "The children are watching." Grace looked up to find Samuel's eyes on her, worry evident in his young face. She picked up her fork and took a bite of the cornbread slathered with real butter, which they hadn't tasted in months. The flavor nearly brought tears to her eyes. The children ate with the focused intensity of the truly hungry, and for once, there was enough for seconds. When they were finished, Kieran produced the candies, earning him looks of pure adoration from Emily and Michael. "May I speak with you outside, Mrs. Fairfield?" Kieran asked as the children savored their treats. Grace followed him onto the porch, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "How long has it been like this?" he asked without preamble. Grace stiffened. "We manage." "That's not what I asked," she sighed, too weary to maintain pretenses. "My husband died last spring, the winter was hard, game's been scarce, we've been struggling, and you've been starving yourself to feed your children." It wasn't a question, but Grace nodded anyway. What mother wouldn't? Kieran's expression was unreadable in the fading light. "I'd like to stay a few days if you'll allow it. Help with some repairs I noticed your cabin needs. I'm handy with tools." "Mr. Zavala, Kieran," he corrected. "Kieran," she amended. "I appreciate your kindness, but as I said, I don't accept charity." "Then consider it payment for room and board. I've been on the trail a long time and could use a proper roof over my head for a few nights." Grace knew she should refuse. A single woman with 3 children couldn't host a strange man without risking her reputation. But the cabin did need repairs before the summer thunderstorms came, and her children had just eaten their first full meal in weeks. 3 days, she relented. "You can stay in the lean-to where we used to keep the horse." Kieran tipped his hat. "Much obliged, madam." That night, after the children were asleep and Kieran had retired to the lean-to, Grace allowed herself to weep silently with relief. For tonight, at least, her children would sleep with full bellies. Tomorrow's worries could wait until morning. The next day, Grace woke to the sound of hammering. She stepped outside to find Kieran already at work, repairing the sagging corner of the porch. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said, pausing mid-swing. "No, I'm usually up with the sun." Grace tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance. "I'll make breakfast." "Already started the coffee," Kieran said with a small smile. "Figured you could use a few extra minutes rest." In the kitchen, Grace found the coffee pot bubbling on the stove and the children already seated at the table, munching on bread with preserves. "Mr. Kieran made us breakfast," Emily announced proudly. "He says we need to let you sleep 'cause you work too hard." Grace felt a flush creep up her neck. That was very thoughtful of him. Over the next few days, Kieran proved himself invaluable. He repaired the leaky roof, reinforced the chicken coop, which had been empty since foxes got the last of their hens months ago, and built a new, sturdier door. He showed Samuel how to set snares properly, taught Emily how to identify edible plants, and entertained little Michael with whittled wooden animals. Each night, he insisted on sleeping in the lean-to, maintaining a respectful distance that Grace found both proper and slightly disappointing. On the morning of the 4th day, when he was supposed to leave, Kieran approached Grace as she hung laundry. "I've been thinking," he began, his hat in his hands. "That garden plot of yours could yield a lot more if it was expanded and properly irrigated." Grace sighed. "Mr. Zavala, Kieran." "Kieran," she corrected with a small smile. "You've already stayed longer than we agreed. I appreciate all you've done, but you mentioned a job waiting in Montana." "It'll wait another week," he said with a shrug. "Friends not expecting me till end of month anyway." Grace studied him, noting the easy way he stood, the kind crinkles at the corners of his eyes, the broad shoulders that had carried her children on countless piggyback rides over the past days. There was something about him that didn't quite align with the drifting cowhand he claimed to be. His speech was educated, his manners refined despite his rough exterior. "Why are you really helping us?" she asked suddenly. Kieran's blue eyes met hers steadily. "Because you remind me of my sister. She was widowed young with 2 little ones. No one was there to help her when she needed it most." "What happened to her?" A shadow passed over his face. "She didn't make it through that first winter. The children went to our aunt in Boston." Grace's heart constricted. "I'm sorry." "So am I," he said quietly. "That's why I can't just ride away knowing you and your children might not make it through another season. Let me help, Grace. Not for charity's sake, but for my own peace of mind." The use of her given name should have shocked her, but somehow it felt right coming from his lips. Grace found herself nodding before she'd made a conscious decision. "1 more week," she conceded. "But you'll take meals with us properly, not out in that lean-to like some hired hand." Kieran's smile transformed his face. "Yes, madam." That evening, as they sat around the table after the children had been put to bed, Grace found herself telling Kieran the whole story: how she'd met Thomas in Philadelphia, where her father was a banker. How they'd eloped when her parents disapproved of the match. How Thomas's dreams of a cattle empire had dwindled to a struggling homestead as debts mounted. "He wasn't practical," she admitted, "but he was kind and he loved us fiercely. The children still miss him terribly." "And you?" Kieran asked softly. "Do you miss him?" Grace considered the question honestly. "I miss having a partner, someone to share the burden with." She looked down at her calloused hands. "Sometimes I'm so tired I can barely think straight, but there's no one else to do what needs doing." "You're remarkable, you know that," Kieran said, his voice low and sincere. "Most people would have given up, gone back to their families." Grace's laugh held little humor. "My father made it quite clear I wasn't welcome back unless I came alone. He never approved of Thomas, and he certainly doesn't want 3 grandchildren he's never met." "His loss," Kieran said firmly. "Those are fine children you're raising." "They are, aren't they?" Grace smiled, her first genuine smile in longer than she could remember. "Though I worry what will happen to them when the bank finally forecloses. It's just a matter of time." Kieran was silent for a long moment, rolling his coffee cup between his palms. "How much do you owe?" Grace named a sum that made her wince every time she thought of it. "And if it were paid? Could you make this place work with a fresh start?" She stared at him. "It's a moot point. I'll never have that kind of money." "But if you did," he persisted. "Is this the life you'd choose? This remote homestead, miles from town, trying to scratch a living from stubborn soil?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know. I never considered having a choice. This was Thomas's dream, not mine, but it's all we have now." Kieran nodded thoughtfully. "Get some rest, Grace. We've got a big day tomorrow if we're going to get that irrigation system working." Over the next week, Kieran worked from dawn till dusk, transforming the property with an efficiency that left Grace breathless. He rigged a clever system to bring water from the creek to her garden, expanded the plot, and planted seeds he'd had in his pack vegetables that would mature quickly in the summer heat. He fixed the wagon that had been sitting useless since a wheel broke months ago, reinforced the cabin walls, and even managed to trade some of his supplies with a passing trapper for 2 laying hens to restock the coop. More surprising was the change in Grace herself. The constant knot of anxiety in her chest began to loosen. With proper meals and Kieran insisting she rest when needed, color returned to her cheeks and strength to her limbs. She found herself laughing at his dry humor, enjoying the conversations that stretched late into the evening after the children were asleep. She tried not to notice the way her heart quickened when their hands accidentally touched, or how his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was foolish to harbor such feelings for a man who would soon ride away. On the last night of his promised week, Grace prepared a special meal with the rabbits Samuel had caught in the newly improved snares. The mood around the table was subdued, the children understanding that their new friend would leave in the morning. "Will you ever come back, Mr. Kieran?" Emily asked, her lower lip trembling slightly. Kieran's eyes met Grace's briefly before he answered. "I'd like to, Miss Emily, if your ma wouldn't mind a visitor from time to time." "You'd be welcome," Grace said softly, ignoring the painful hope blooming in her chest. After the children were asleep, Kieran asked Grace to join him on the porch. The night was clear, a blanket of stars stretched across the Wyoming sky. "I need to tell you something before I go," he said, his expression serious in the lantern light. "I haven't been entirely truthful with you." Grace's heart sank. Here it was the revelation that would shatter the fragile trust between them. Perhaps he was married or running from the law. She steeled herself. "I'm not just a cowhand," Kieran continued. "My full name is Kieran James Zavala. My father is Miguel Zavala." Grace's eyes widened. Even in her isolated homestead, she'd heard of Miguel Zavala, one of the wealthiest cattle barons in Colorado. "You're heir to the Zavala ranch," she whispered. Kieran nodded. "My father built an empire from nothing. He expected me to step into his boots without question, but I wanted to make my own way. We had a falling out last year. I've been drifting since, working ranches under assumed names, learning the business from the ground up. The job in Montana, real enough, but not urgent. A friend who doesn't care about my last name offered me a foreman position." Grace processed this information, pieces falling into place. "That's why you recognize the financial troubles here so quickly. Why you knew exactly how to improve the property." "I've seen a lot of operations, good and bad," he admitted. 2 weeks ago, I got word that my father is ill. I'm on my way back to Colorado to reconcile before it's too late." "I'm glad," Grace said sincerely. "Life's too short for family estrangements." Kieran took a deep breath. "There's more, Grace. Before I leave tomorrow, I want to make you an offer." Her spine stiffened. "If this is charity, it's business," he interrupted firmly. "I want to buy this property from you." Grace blinked in surprise. "What?" "The location is perfect for a way station between the main trails. The creek provides year-round water, and with some investment, this could be a profitable stopping place for travelers and freight wagons." "You want to buy my home?" Grace's voice rose slightly. "I want to give you a way out," Kieran said gently. "A chance to start fresh somewhere better suited for raising 3 children, somewhere with a school, proper medical care." Grace stood abruptly. "This was Thomas's dream. I can't just sell it." "Thomas is gone, Grace," Kieran said, rising to stand beside her. "And with all due respect, his dream is drowning you and those children." "How dare you?" she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "I dare because I care what happens to you," he replied, his voice intense. "Because watching you slowly starve yourself to feed your children breaks something in me. Because those kids deserve more than a life of constant struggle in the middle of nowhere." Grace turned away, arms wrapped around herself. "Even if I wanted to, I can't sell what the bank is about to take." "I'll settle with the bank. I'll pay you fair market value, on top of that enough for you to buy a proper home in town, maybe open a small business." "Why?" Grace asked, turning back to face him. "Why would you do this?" Kieran stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Because from the moment I saw you collapse in that meadow, too hungry to stand but still clutching food for your children, I knew you were the strongest, most remarkable woman I'd ever met." His hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "Because I can't bear the thought of riding away tomorrow knowing I might never see you again." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "Kieran." "I'm not asking for promises," he said quickly. "Just a chance. Take the offer. Move to Sweetwater Springs. Let me call on you properly when I return from Colorado." Grace closed her eyes, leaning slightly into his touch. The practical part of her, the part that had kept her family alive this past year, recognized the wisdom in his offer. But her heart feared exchanging one kind of dependency for another. "I need to think," she whispered. Kieran nodded, stepping back. "Of course. Sleep on it. We'll talk in the morning." Grace barely slept that night, her mind churning with possibilities. By dawn, she had her answer. She found Kieran already outside, saddling his horse. The sight of him preparing to leave sent a pang through her chest. "I have conditions," she said without preamble. Kieran turned, surprise evident on his face. "You'll sell?" "Yes," Grace said firmly. "But on my terms. I want a business partnership, not charity disguised as a purchase." Kieran's eyebrows rose. "I'm listening." "You buy the property and develop it as you see fit. I'll move the children to town, but I retain a 20% ownership stake in whatever business you establish here." "Grace, I'm not finished," she continued. "I'll use the money to open a boarding house in Sweetwater Springs. It needs one, and I'm a good cook and housekeeper. That way I'll have my own income, independent of this arrangement." A slow smile spread across Kieran's face. "You've given this some thought." "All night," she admitted. "Those are my terms. Do you accept?" "One amendment," Kieran countered. 30% ownership stake. And I want first right to invest in your boarding house venture as a silent partner only." Grace considered this. 25%. "And you can invest, but decisions about the boarding house remain entirely mine." Kieran extended his hand. "Deal, Mrs. Fairfield." Grace took his hand, the contact sending warmth up her arm. "Deal, Mr. Zavala." They stood there, hands clasped between them, something unspoken but powerful hanging in the air. Finally, Kieran cleared his throat. "I'll need to go to Colorado, but I'll send a telegram to my lawyer in Cheyenne today to begin the paperwork." "Can you manage until I return?" Grace smiled. "With the supplies you've brought and the improvements you've made, we'll be fine for a month or more. Take the time you need with your father." Kieran's expression grew serious. "I meant what I said last night, Grace. This isn't just business for me." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I know." Impulsively, she rose on tiptoes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. "For luck with your father," she explained quickly, stepping back. Kieran's smile was slow and warm. "I'll be back within a month, sooner if I can manage it." The children were devastated to see him go, but brightened considerably when Grace explained they would be moving to town soon. The prospect of other children to play with and a real school for Samuel and Emily outweighed their sadness. True to his word, Kieran's lawyer arrived 10 days later with paperwork and an initial payment that left Grace lightheaded. The banknote was settled, and arrangements were made for Grace to begin looking for suitable property in Sweetwater Springs for her boarding house. 3 weeks after Kieran's departure, Grace and her children moved into a rented cottage in town, while she finalized the purchase of a large 2-story home on a corner lot perfect for conversion to a boarding house. The townsfolk were curious about the widow who suddenly seemed to have means, but Grace kept her business arrangements private, saying only that she had sold her homestead to an investor. She threw herself into renovating the boarding house, hiring local carpenters to add additional bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Work that would have taken months on her own progressed rapidly with paid help. By the time a month had passed, the Fairfield house was ready to welcome its first paying guests, and still, there was no word from Kieran. Grace told herself not to worry. He had family matters to attend to, a complicated relationship with his father to mend. He would come when he could. Yet as days stretched into weeks, Doubt began to creep in. Perhaps he'd reconsidered his interest in her. Perhaps the connection she'd felt had been one-sided, born of gratitude and proximity. 6 weeks after his departure, Grace was serving breakfast to her 3 boarders, a schoolteacher, a clerk from the mercantile, and an elderly widow when Samuel burst through the front door. "Mama, there's a fancy carriage outside with a man asking for you." Grace's heart leapt, then settled. A fancy carriage didn't sound like Kieran. More likely it was a potential boarder or business matter. "Show him to the parlor, Samuel. I'll be there in a moment." After ensuring her other guests were attended to, Grace smoothed her apron, tucked a loose strand of hair back into her bun, and made her way to the parlor. She paused in the doorway, her breath catching. Kieran stood by the window, dressed not in the worn trail clothes she remembered, but in a well-tailored suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He turned at her entrance, his face breaking into a smile that warmed her to her toes. "Grace." Just her name, but the way he said it made her heart flutter. "Kieran, you're back." "I am." He crossed the room to stand before her. "You look well, truly well." "The boarding house is already turning a profit," she said, gesturing to the tastefully furnished room around them. "And the children are thriving in town. Samuel's top of his class, and Emily's made so many friends. And you, are you happy with our arrangement?" "Very," she admitted. "Though I did wonder if you'd changed your mind when weeks passed without word." Kieran's expression grew serious. "I should have sent a telegram. Things with my father were complicated. He's recovering now, but it was touch and go for a while." "I'm glad he's better," Grace said sincerely. "We've reconciled after a fashion," Kieran continued. "He's agreed to let me pursue my own ventures while still maintaining my place in the family business." "That's wonderful news." Kieran took a step closer. "There's more. I've spent the past weeks setting things in motion. Your former homestead is already being expanded. I've hired a crew to build a proper way station, accommodations for travelers, a store, stables." "So quickly?" Grace was impressed despite herself. "I don't waste time when I see potential," Kieran said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Which brings me to the other reason for my visit." From his pocket, he withdrew a small leather-bound book. "The deed to your former property with your 25% ownership officially recorded." Grace took the document, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you." "And this," Kieran continued, producing a sealed envelope, "is the business plan and projected earnings for the first 3 years. I think you'll find your investment will pay handsome dividends." Grace set both items aside on a nearby table. "Is that all that brings you back to Sweetwater Springs?" "Business?" Kieran's smile was slow and knowing. "Not even close, Mrs. Fairfield." He stepped closer still, close enough that she could detect the scent of sandalwood and leather that she remembered from those nights on her porch. "I've spent 6 weeks thinking about you," he said, his voice low. "About your courage, your intelligence, your stubborn pride." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Is that so?" "It is." His hand came up to gently touch her face, just as he had that last night. "I know it's forward of me. We've known each other such a short time. But I've never been more certain of anything than I am of how I feel about you, Grace Fairfield." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "And how is that, Mr. Zavala?" "Like I've been wandering my whole life, only to find home in a meadow where a stubborn, starving woman refused to think of herself before her children." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "Kieran, I'm not asking for promises," he said, echoing his words from weeks before. "Just permission to court you properly, to see if what began in that cabin might grow into something lasting." Grace looked up at him, this man who had saved her family and asked for nothing in return, except the chance to know her better. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like that very much." Kieran's smile was radiant. "May I call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps take you to dinner at the hotel?" "Yes," Grace replied, her own smile breaking free. "Though you should know, the children will be terribly disappointed if you don't stay and tell them all about your travels." "I wouldn't dream of disappointing them," Kieran said with mock seriousness. "Or their mother." In the weeks that followed, Kieran became a regular visitor at the Fairfield house. He brought gifts for the children, books for Samuel, a porcelain doll for Emily, and wooden toys for Michael. For Grace, he brought flowers, small thoughtful tokens, and most precious of all, his time and attention. They took walks through town, rode out to check on the progress at the way station, and spent evenings on the boarding house porch after the children were asleep. Grace found herself laughing more than she had in years, sharing hopes and dreams she'd long since buried. The townsfolk gossiped, of course. The handsome, wealthy cattleman calling on the widow Fairfield raised eyebrows and sparked speculation. Grace found she didn't care. For the first time since Thomas's death, perhaps for the first time in her life, she was making choices based on her own happiness, not mere survival. 3 months after Kieran's return, the way station officially opened for business. Named Fairfield Station over Grace's protests, it quickly became a popular stop for travelers between Sweetwater Springs and Laramie. As Kieran had predicted, Grace's investment began paying dividends almost immediately. It was after the opening celebration, as Kieran walked Grace and the children back to town, that Michael asked the question that had been on all their minds. "Mr. Kieran, are you going to be our new pa?" Grace nearly tripped over her own feet. "Michael, that's not an appropriate question." But Kieran stopped walking, kneeling down to Michael's level. "Would you like that, buddy, if I asked to be part of your family?" Michael nodded solemnly. "You make Mama smile, and you taught me to fish." "High recommendations indeed," Kieran said with a grin, ruffling the boy's hair. He glanced up at Grace, whose face had flushed crimson. "What about you two?" he asked Samuel and Emily. Samuel, always the serious one, considered the question carefully. "You make Mama happy, and you're teaching me things Pa would have, so I guess it would be all right." Emily was less restrained. "Yes, please, then maybe I could have a sister." "Emily," Grace gasped, mortification complete. Kieran stood, his eyes twinkling with barely suppressed laughter. "I see I have the children's blessing. That's good to know." The rest of the walk passed in awkward silence, at least for Grace. When they reached the boarding house, Kieran helped get the children settled for the night before asking Grace to join him on the front porch. The October evening was crisp, stars brilliant in the clear Wyoming sky. Grace wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, unable to meet Kieran's eyes. "I'm so sorry about Michael," she began. "Children say the most inappropriate—" "Grace," Kieran interrupted gently. "Look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly to find him watching her with tender amusement. "I'm not upset. Far from it." "You're not." Kieran took her hands in his. "I've been trying to find the right moment, the perfect words. Leave it to a 4-year-old to cut straight to the heart of the matter." Grace's breath caught as Kieran sank to one knee before her, still holding her hands. "I know it hasn't been very long," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Grace Fairfield. I love your strength, your determination, your kindness. I love the way you put your children first always. I love the businesswoman you've become, and the mother you've always been." Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as Kieran continued. "I want to build a life with you not because you need saving, but because together we're better than we are apart. Will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Grace was nodding before he finished speaking. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Kieran." He stood and pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that held both tender promise and barely restrained passion. Grace melted against him, all doubts vanishing in the certainty of his embrace. When they finally broke apart, breathless and smiling, Kieran pressed his forehead to hers. "I should warn you if you marry me. You'll never go hungry again. Not for food, not for love, not for anything I have the power to give you." Grace laughed softly. "Is that a threat, Mr. Zavala?" "A solemn vow, Mrs. Fairfield. Soon to be Mrs. Zavala." They were married in the town church on a bright December morning, with Samuel giving his mother away, Emily scattering flower petals, and Michael carrying the rings on a small velvet pillow. Kieran's father, still frail but determined to see his son wed, made the journey from Colorado with Kieran's two sisters and their families. To Grace's surprise, her own parents appeared the day before the wedding, having received Kieran's letter informing them of the upcoming nuptials. The reunion was tearful and tentative, years of estrangement not easily overcome, but the first steps toward reconciliation were taken as her father walked her down the aisle alongside Samuel. The couple honeymooned in Denver, a luxury Grace never imagined she'd experience, while the children stayed with Kieran's sister Rosa, who had taken an immediate liking to her new niece and nephews. Upon their return, they moved into a new home Kieran had built on the edge of town, large enough for their family but not ostentatious, with a garden for Grace and a workshop for Kieran's woodworking hobby. The Fairfield house continued operations under the management of a capable widow Grace had hired, providing her with a continued source of independent income. Kieran divided his time between the growing way station business and his father's ranch interests, but always made sure to be home for dinner with his family. Grace found in him the true partner she had longed for, someone who valued her opinions, supported her independence, and loved her children as his own. 10 months after their wedding, Grace gave birth to a son they named Thomas Miguel Zavala, honoring both the father her children had lost and the grandfather who had welcomed them into the Zavala family. Kieran proved to be as devoted a father to the baby as he was to his adopted children, spending hours rocking the infant so Grace could rest. 2 years later, Emily's wish came true with the arrival of a baby sister, Rosa Elizabeth. Their family was complete. On the 5th anniversary of the day Kieran had found Grace collapsed in the meadow, they picnicked at the spot, now part of the thriving Fairfield station property. Their children played nearby, Samuel at 14 showing interest in the business aspects of the way station, Emily at 12 mothering her younger siblings, Michael at 9 racing about with endless energy, and the two youngest toddling after their older brothers and sister. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been?" Kieran asked as they watched their family. "If I'd taken the main trail that day instead of the scenic route," Grace leaned against his shoulder, contentment warming her from within. "Sometimes. But then I remember something my grandmother used to say, that there are no accidents in life, only appointments we didn't know we had." Kieran's arm tightened around her. "Well, I'm certainly glad I kept that appointment. Best decision I ever made." Grace turned to look at the man who had saved her in more ways than one, the man who had seen her strength when she felt weakest, who had offered partnership instead of charity, who had given her the freedom to become more than just a survivor. "I love you, Kieran Zavala," she said simply. His smile, still capable of making her heart race after all these years, was tender as he lowered his lips to hers. "And I love you, Grace Zavala. Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." As their children's laughter echoed across the meadow, Grace closed her eyes and offered a silent prayer of gratitude for hungry days that had led to a lifetime of fulfillment. for a stranger's kindness that had blossomed into enduring love, and for the journey that had brought her home to the arms where she belonged. In the years that followed, Fairfield Station grew into a small settlement of its own, with a general store, blacksmith, and eventually a schoolhouse. Sweetwater Springs prospered as well, the railway finally extending a spur line that connected the town to larger markets. The Zavala children grew up with the best of both worlds, the stability and education of town life, and frequent excursions to both Fairfield Station and the Zavala Ranch in Colorado. Samuel eventually took over management of the way station, his head for business matching his stepfather's. Emily trained as a teacher and opened a school for the children of settlers too remote to attend the town school. Michael, to everyone's surprise, developed an interest in medicine and went east to study, returning years later as the region's first proper doctor. Grace and Kieran watched their family thrive, their love deepening with each passing year. They weathered the inevitable storms of life together: Kieran's father's passing, Grace's mother's lingering illness, the economic downturns that tested their business acumen. Through it all, they maintained the tradition of their anniversary picnic at the meadow where they'd first met, remembering the hungry woman who'd fed her children first, and the cowboy who'd brought enough food for the whole family, the beginning of a love story neither could have imagined that fateful day in the Wyoming wilderness. And on quiet evenings, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the western sky, they would hold hands and marvel at how the hardest, hungriest days of Grace's life had led to her greatest blessing: a love born of desperation, but sustained by choice, day after day, year after year, until the end of their days.